So we are using two different HTML elements now, h1 and p. And that leads to this output. Now, I don't know about you, but that output can definitely be improved visually. It is worth noting, though, that we do have some default styling here. The heading, the h1 tag, definitely looks different than our regular text. And the reason for that is that the browser by default assigns some styling to some, but not all, HTML elements. For example, the h1 element receives some default styling. Now, it is important that that default styling is a nice to have feature, but not something you should rely on. It differs between operating systems and browsers, and it can be overwritten with CSS, cascading style sheets, that second programming language which I mentioned earlier. And therefore, typically as a developer, we want to add our own styles, also because those default styles are not that beautiful and are rarely what we want. And hence, we'll now dive into CSS, and we're going to start writing some CSS code to change that styling. And I want to start with that h1 element. It's okay, but I want to change the font type. I want to switch to a different text font. And we also might want to center this text and maybe also change the color of this text slightly. And all that can be done with CSS. Now, how do we then add this CSS code and how does it look like? Adding it isn't too difficult. We just need to go to the element which we want to style, and then on this opening tag, before that greater than sign, we add a so-called HTML attribute. We do that by adding a white space here, and then add one of the supported attributes. In this case, the style attribute. Now that's something we haven't done before though. HTML attributes are not something we used before. Now attributes are extra pieces of information you can add to your HTML elements. And different HTML elements support different attributes. For example, basically all HTML elements support the style attribute. And these attributes are always added on the opening tag, and then we can add extra pieces of information or change the behavior of that element on which we add them with those attributes. You can also learn more about the attributes if you hover over them in Visual Studio Code, and you also get some helpful auto-completion. If I start typing a S, for example, I see all the attributes I can add to this h1 element, and the further I type, the more this is narrowed down until just the style is left. And then you can always hit Tab to auto-complete this and have it added for you. Here you also see now how you then complete such an attribute, how you assign a value. Because the attribute name, as it's called here, on the left side of this equal sign, just tells the browser which attribute you want to set. You then assign a value between double quotes, opening and closing double quotes, to, well, set the value for this attribute. And which value you can set depends on which attribute you're setting. In case of the style attribute, for example, we'll be able to set some CSS code as a value between those quotes. And attributes are typically always set like this. Attribute name, then no white space, that's important, no white space, equal sign, no white space, double quotes, opening and closing. That's how you should set your attributes in HTML. And that's how you can then change the behavior of HTML elements. So what is now the value we want to set for this style attribute here?